First of all, very warm welcome. Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for this workshop. My name is John Battler. I'm a director of the European Policies Research Centre and part of the NICE team. This is the first coffee break workshop, which is being held as part of the programme of work of NICE, which stands for Net Zero Industrial Cluster Exchange. It's a developing network which is a knowledge sharing platform focusing on how regional and local development strategies can effectively support the transformation of places, of regions, cities towards decarbonisation and net zero. It's running for a 2-year period in the first instance, co-funded by Michelin and by the Scottish Government. And our coffee break workshops will support this knowledge sharing and discuss several technical and policy topics related to industrial carbonisation and strategies. So we're delighted to welcome you all to this workshop today, and hopefully for future workshops also. Today, we're delighted to welcome Lewis Barlow, who will be sharing his insights on carbon management guidance for projects and programmes, drawing on his experience with the Scottish city, region and growth deals. We expect the presentation to last for about 30 minutes, and we'll then use the remaining time to open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. And we very much encourage you to take part and also to use the chat function to make comments or questions. And as usual, when it comes to the discussion, please do use the raise hand function if you're not using the chat. Before I introduce Lewis, I'd like to let you know that the presentation is being recorded, not the subsequent discussion, just the presentation, which means that you or colleagues will have the opportunity to follow the meeting at a later stage, and we'll make the recording available on our YouTube channel and our NICE website, and we'll share you the details by email. We also encourage you to use Twitter to share your thoughts on the webinar with the hashtag NiceNetCBW. So let me present our speaker today. Lewis Barlow. He provides expert advice on whole life decarbonisation for local authorities, developers, governments at the highest level. This is recognised internationally for his skills and experience in reducing carbon on major projects. He's written carbon management in infrastructure guidance and run courses. He's worked clearly with design teams to ensure that opportunities for carbon and cost reduction are understood and pursued wherever possible. And clearly, this work has international significance and indeed has been recognised as such. So we've got an excellent speaker to be talking about carbon management guidance. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Lewis. Lewis, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Let me just attempt to share my screen, and then we can get started. Okay. Right, so here we go. Before I begin, I made a note. I just wrote something down here that, which is to say that what I'm covering now over the next 20 minutes or half an hour, it is relevant wherever you are, whatever country you're in, whatever project or program you're involved with. This is in some shape or form of relevance. I'm absolutely certain of it. So I'll do my best to explain it. At its heart, it's very, very simple. And then hopefully we can have time for some questions. And if we don't get time for questions, please get in touch with me afterwards. That's absolutely fine. So just a quick slide on my background. I suppose you could say my area of expertise is decarbonisation. Net zero is part of that, of course. I'm a technical director at WSP. I just joined WSP recently, coming from the Scottish Government, as John mentioned. I'm a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, chartered a few different ways. I'm vice chair of the ICE's Decarbonisation Advisory Board, and I'm involved in the new PAS 2080. I will explain what that means shortly. And I give lots of training on this subject to the public and private sector and all sorts of different stakeholders. I've worked in the public and private sector as a client, as a consultant, supporting contractors, rail, road, Antarctic, HS2, defence estates, homes for Scotland, all sorts of different aspects. So I think I've got a reasonable idea of what's going on in the industry and the challenges that we face. Oh, I'm also a magician. That's just a plug. If you want some magic done, just get in touch. That's a separate thing. Some people find that more interesting. This is what underpins everything that I've been doing, well, probably since my career started. It's numbers, not adjectives. That's the phrase, numbers, not adjectives. And that's not my phrase. It was the phrase of this chap here, the late Professor David Mackay, former chief UK government scientist, and he wrote a book called Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. And he was looking at what we would now call net zero solutions in a fossil-free world in the future. How would we supply the energy without using fossil fuels? And it's a great book. He's looked at various different pathways. He's not biased. It's very impartial. So at its heart, he's looking at transparent, practical ways, cost-effective ways to get to what we would now call net zero. And that's really what we need. He said, I'm concerned about cutting UK emissions of twaddle. And if you don't know what twaddle is, it's the same thing as the blah, blah, blah that Greta Thunberg talks about when she's pointing at politicians and saying, you say net zero, you say decarbonization, but what are you actually doing? It's all blah, blah, blah. I do sympathize with that opinion a little bit. There is a lot of blah, blah, blah still around. We need to flush that away, demystify all of this, get rid of the twaddle, focus on how we're going to really most cost effectively get to net zero. I mentioned whole life carbon, whole life decarbonization. That's what we must consider. It's not just energy related carbon. It's all the carbon backstory to things we call embodied carbon. So this is an excerpt from a sustainability brochure where all the bikes have the embodied carbon breakdown, all the elements of the bikes clearly listed. And that's great. So consumers can base their decision on buying a bike, not only on its performance and price, but its carbon backstory, history, embodied carbon. They're all listed, embodied carbon of everything, including electronic bikes. And that's great. But this isn't a new thing. This has been around for quite some time. I remember 20 years ago, Walker's Crisps putting the carbon footprint of the packet of crisps on the back of every packet of crisps. The Carbon Trust had worked it out from the potato seed to disposing of the crisp packet. And that's 20 years ago. And you could say they were ahead of their time, but actually I think we as an industry, as a planet, we're behind the times. We really should be understanding the whole life carbon emissions impact of everything that we do, especially big projects and big programs and policies. So turning to the Scottish city and regional growth deals, this is something on which I was working for the last couple of years. I was seconded into the Scottish Government to help to align these deals with net zero. So what are these deals? They are economic instruments in a way to drive sustainable economic growth. In simple numbers, there are 12 of them, 12 deal regions, 200 projects, 1.9 billion Scottish Government investment. And when you add up UK government and local authorities and bits of private sector, it's over £5 billion total investment, 10 to 15 year program, more or less, with the aim of creating over 80,000 new jobs and decent, good jobs as well. So very ambitious program, but it needed alignment with net zero and high level climate change policy, national climate change policy. So you could boil down the objectives that I had, so I was there for 2 years trying to do this, into very simple properties. One, I wanted to make sure that all projects were quantifying carbon consistently and transparently. That's whole life carbon as well, not just embodied carbon or energy carbon. It's the whole thing, decommissioning, people using the infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. And I put direct and indirect here. So I'll cover that later on. That's shorthand for control and influence, which I will explain. But anyway, number one is just carbon accounting, right? So that's a fundamental. Number two is trying to ensure that all the projects and programs were deploying best practice carbon management. So trying to actively reduce the carbon as much as possible. And then there was the recognition that if 1 and 2 are being consistently applied properly, they will identify issues. This isn't all going to go swimmingly. You know, we know that there are problems in this, you know, otherwise we'd be hitting net zero tomorrow. So by implementing this all the way across Scotland, we could identify these barriers, potential or perceived, e.g. inflexibility of standards, technology not being there, lack of skills in the public sector, lack of skills in the private sector, or materials, lowest carbon materials perhaps being more expensive or not available yet. And it wasn't just identifying these issues, it was feeding that back through government to try to ensure that government money was best spent on achieving net zero. Because I describe this phase that we're in, this phase of years, and I feel like we're in a kind of a 5-year period, and I feel like we're maybe a couple of years into that period. I describe this as a reality check phase. It's a reality check. We've got national net zero targets. We've got national net zero dates based on science, trying to stay below 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees global temperature rise. So we've got the legislation in place. It's how to practically deliver it. That's the difficult thing. And so this was all encompassed in this document, the carbon management guidance for projects and programs, and that's available online. There's a link there at the bottom. You can just Google it, Scottish Government carbon guidance, city deals, and you'll find it. And it's all there. And I'm almost jumping to the end of this presentation by saying that I really believe that there are some key tools in there, you know, things that would mean that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You know, there are mechanisms for assessing carbon, valuing carbon, and ultimately, I do believe that this could be an early form of a net zero test. And if you haven't heard that phrase before, I would encourage it to stick in your mind. Net zero test is what we really need in everything that we do. Someone's proposing something. The first and most simple question is the thing you're proposing going to make matters better or worse for the global environment and global atmosphere? It's such a simple question, but it's a question that's quite often avoided or too difficult. And carbon management and carbon accounting is usually pushed much further down the line and avoided. So we can't do that. We must tackle whole life carbon right up front, right from the beginning, and think of it as a net zero test. So this is coming. I'm absolutely certain of it. This is a breakdown of the deals in simple terms. So again, about 200 projects ranging from non-residential buildings, so commercial sort of office space, transportation infrastructure, including active travel projects, platforming works, enabling infrastructure to then lead to further development. The skills and research projects, they're the kind of people projects where nothing's being built, but there's still money going into two things. Residential buildings, digital infrastructure, and energy infrastructure. But you can simplify all of this into 3 categories, really: buildings projects, infrastructure projects, and people projects. So we needed to make sure that there was an approach to managing and minimizing carbon on all of these project types. And I didn't have to write that already existed. It had been written fairly recently by others. So it was more a point of me signposting these existing management documents. Another way of thinking about what we were doing, what Scottish Government still is doing, and what I'm currently doing, and I'll hopefully be supporting the Scottish Government still. It's joining the dots between a lot of things. Climate emergency, the planning process, so getting planning permission, going through local authority planning regulation to allow projects to be built, technical best practice, which is evolving, and funding, money, and the Green Book. And if you don't know what the Green Book is, it's the manual for obtaining government funding, central government funding in the UK. So you've got a project or a program or something that needs some central government money, you should follow the rules of the Green Book. And the Green Book has got carbon requirements in it that have been amplified fairly recently. So it's aligning projects with all these things. Each one of them is shifting and evolving, you know, and you can see it. I can see it certainly working on different projects all the time. So it's a challenge to try to stay ahead of the game, try to stay ahead of the curve. And that's what the guidance document seeks to do. The procedures that we point to for buildings and infrastructure are the RICS, Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, Whole Life Carbon Assessment for the Built Environment document, which is just about to be updated, and PAS 2080, Carbon Management in Infrastructure, which also is just about to be updated. It's going to become Carbon Management in Buildings and Infrastructure. So they're compatible with each other. They're compatible with all best practice carbon management approaches, no matter what country you're in. You know, there'll be some equivalent of these. In fact, PAS 2080 is a kind of international standard. I don't think there's anything like it elsewhere at the moment, at least. But if, you know, no matter what country you're in, if you're following international best practice in whole life carbon management, you will be compatible with these approaches, no doubt. So the guidance, the Scottish City Deals guidance says, for buildings, you should follow RICS, for infrastructure, PAS 2080. We weren't totally prescriptive about that. You know, we were saying, if you have an alternative approach that's at least as good as these, by all means, we're all ears. But frankly, there isn't anything that's better than these. So everyone was just sticking with these. This is the document that's getting updated very shortly in a couple of months, PAS 2080. It's set to become the international standard for managing whole life carbon across the built environment. So not just infrastructure, not just buildings, everything that that can be constructed. Due to be republished very soon. And I encourage everyone to question, you know, if you've got a building project, you can kind of just ask the question, well, are we applying PAS 2080 on this project? And if someone says, what's PAS 2080? That's a red flag. Okay, that suggests that they maybe don't know whether or not whole life carbon is even being managed. But it should be. It should be. I see PAS 2080 from various angles starting to be mandated. We effectively mandated it on the City Deals approach. I see Department for Transport, UK Department for Transport, have mandated it for all their arm's length bodies, HS2, East West Rail, National Highways, Network Rail. By the end of this year, by the end of 2023, everyone needs to follow this. I predict that local authorities will do the same. So very, very shortly, everyone will be following this. Now, they're not all going to be following it perfectly, but it is a great start. So within, I reckon, 1 or 2 years, we'll start to have good data to be able to say, how are we really going to achieve these national targets if we're still planning to do project X, Y, and Z? And the proper implementation of PAS 2080 isn't just determining how to minimize carbon on projects. It's earlier than that. It's a way of determining which are the right projects to choose. So that's the big picture. Stakeholder, governmental, asset manager level. What are the right projects to do if we want to get to net zero? Never mind what's the best kind of steel and concrete. That's all important once you've got the project, once the project's, you know, going ahead. But this is a very high level document. Well, it applies to all levels, I should say. This is a an excerpt from the current PAS 2080, just very quickly to explain. The green ribbon is project process. So starting from strategic stage all the way through to construction, operation, and end of life. And this is just trying to depict that the accuracy of your carbon assessment will increase as you move through these stages. As you know more about the project, you know what's going to get constructed, but your ability to influence whole life carbon correspondingly decreases. Okay, they're sort of mirror images of each other. And that's not to say that therefore we should wait till just before we construct something to decide what kind of concrete we're using. It's quite the opposite. It's saying it's okay for your carbon estimates to be very rough at the very earliest stage, because then you have influence over what you do. And a rule of thumb is the carbon assessment should really be as accurate or inaccurate as your cost estimate. So we don't have time to go into it today, but there's a very interesting relationship between carbon and cost. And if you're ever struggling to think, how do I deal with carbon? Just think, how do I deal with cost? How do I deal with cost? So you estimate it right at the beginning, then you work out ways to try and minimize it. You're trying to spend as little as possible and get the most out of the outcome, so best value for money. So this is something that we adopted in the city deals that's in PAS 2080, and it proved very useful for categorizing projects. And as I describe it, hopefully you can think about how you would apply this to your projects or programs or policies. So the first category is control. That's where project owners have the ability to manage through direct design and operational requirements that the carbon associated with those projects. So that's materials, quantities of things, how things work, the energy that's going to be used. So controllable. You might not think that that's controllable, but it's controllable in the same way as the cost is controllable. And we set up 5 categories there. One is a project might be whole life carbon negative. That means after the project's phase is complete, once it's built and its operating period has completed, whatever that appraisal period is, could be 60 years, could be 100 years. After that period, there'll be less carbon in the atmosphere than if the project hadn't gone ahead. So this carbon negative, bear in mind, this isn't sort of, tricksy offsetting speak. This is really meaning this project is going to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and safely store it somewhere permanently. So that's very rare, very, very rare. I think there's probably 1 or 2 of the 200 projects that are in that category. And that's due to them planting lots and lots of trees. So anyway, that's whole life carbon negative. Whole life carbon net zero is, it's more of a theoretical concept really, where you for example, build a building, it's going to be operationally net zero. So you're not going to put gas boilers in. It's going to use electricity, for example, that's come from renewables. So it's going to be operationally net zero. There will be carbon emitted to create it, but somehow that's going to be balanced by carbon getting sucked out the atmosphere. If not on the site, then somewhere else. So that's why I say it's kind of a theoretical concept, because that's when you're into the world of offsetting almost and thinking, how do I balance this to get to net zero? This is what net zero is all about. Number 3, and this is the most common category, not just within the deals, but within anything that we build these days, mostly, there'll be capital carbon increase. A capital carbon is more or less the same as embodied carbon. So there'll be carbon spent to create the project, but then it will be operationally net zero, at least in accordance with national policy. So it might not be operationally net zero immediately, but it will be according to the trajectory towards net zero. And in Scotland, that's by 2045, rest of the UK, 2050. Some other countries, Sweden, 2045, that's the sort of overall target date. 4 is capital and operational carbon increase. So you build a building and then you're planning to heat it using gas. So that would be increasing the carbon from construction and operation. And then 5, again, it's a bit of a sort of almost a theoretical category, just simply operational carbon increase, where nothing's being built, but money will perhaps create an industry to cause an industry to grow. The industry is already emitting carbon, and therefore you're causing an operational increase without building anything. Now that's the control side. The influence is what happens more widely as a result of the project. So it's where the project may affect carbon emissions beyond the boundary of carbon control, e.g. through the use of buildings or infrastructure. That's even simpler, 3 categories. Number 1, or A, the project results in carbon savings. Something that the project is doing is going to help speed up the journey towards net zero, e.g. faster uptake of renewables. B is negligible. The project won't really have any influence beyond its boundary that could be quantified. You know, it's really got nothing to do with the wider climate emergency, apart from what we are doing within the site itself. And C is carbon increase, e.g. an increase in vehicle kilometers. If you're building a road that would then enable a further development or a further road or more vehicles to be on the road, driving more greater distances, that would be a category C. Now you're thinking, why do we set up these categories? What's the point of all of this? It's to enable us to quickly look across the project portfolio and categorize them, and then work out where we should really focus our attention. Which ones do we need to prioritize? Which ones appear to be on the wrong side of the line towards net zero? And that's 4s, 5s, and Cs. So that, you know, if we keep things as simple as possible, working with the project owners to explain this very clearly, these are the ones that were flagged early on. And that's when we were having conversations about, well, why can't it be a 3? What would it take to move from a 4 to a 3? What are the barriers to this? You know, and very quickly we get a very simple but very useful understanding of the entire deals program. So it's just some quick hypothetical examples. I'll very quickly go through these because I think this presentation will be available online afterwards. So I'll give you a 1A. A new technology for extracting carbon from the atmosphere that extracts more carbon than was emitted to create it. Its success leads to the accelerated uptake of this technology across the country. That's a 1A, extremely rare. In fact, I don't think there are any 1As. It's a kind of an academic category. Then let's go down to a bad one. A building that's going to have no measurable bearing on wider carbon emissions and is designed with a gas-fired heating system. That's the 4. And the B means it's going to do nothing really to help the wider climate emergency. The other reason we set up these categories, and hopefully you can, you know, use this if you can use any of this if you want. I'm very keen to share it. It helps to demystify things and brush away any greenwash or people pretending that things are net zero or pretending things are carbon neutral or carbon conscious. I saw quite a lot of descriptions like that. And I think, you know, if I'm being cynical about it, people know there's a climate emergency. They might not know what it's about or how to fix it. There's a climate emergency. It's all about net zero. David Attenborough, Greta Thunberg, et cetera, et cetera. So they know that this is important to governments and funders as well. So I feel quite often people will throw in this kind of language just to try to get funding or to help get funding. This is a net zero project. This is going to help us with the climate emergency. But this categorization process gets through all that very, very quickly, because if anyone's saying that it's going to help, then we would say, well, that sounds like an influence category. How is it going to help? Can you quantify that? Can we work out some numbers? And sometimes people would say, yes, here are the numbers. Here's what we predict. And sometimes they'd say, well, actually, now you've mentioned it, probably this project isn't going to have such a big, wider influence. And that's kind of good, you know, because we just demystified it, set up the categories, and there was no room for that sort of stuff anymore. Okay, so I'll take you through this graph to show you an example of a couple of these categories. And this is looking at carbon emissions impact. So that there are a lot of phrases involved in this area, but carbon emissions impact is a very important one, I think. Impact is a word that you might imagine as kind of slightly emotive, because it sounds like impact. It's a bad thing, and I wondered, is this a neutral word? Is this a sort of word we should be using in policy? I mean, I was for it. Then I was pleased to see that that is the phrase that's in the UK government Green Book. That's the Treasury description of the whole life carbon emissions result. It's called carbon emissions impact. So again, if you're looking at a policy or program or project, it's a legitimate question to ask. Interesting project. What's the carbon emissions impact of this project? And again, if people look at you with a blank look, that's a red flag. So carbon emissions impact. So look at this then. So this is let's say this is now from recollection, this is maybe a 3B. So we're going to build a building, and it's going to be become operationally net zero, but it doesn't have any wider impact. So we've got carbon, plus and minus, up the left-hand side, and years going forward. So you build the building, there's embodied carbon at the beginning, that's the beginning of the graph. And then it might have some operational carbon emissions, perhaps as it's getting fully onto renewable energy, or as it plans to retrofit the existing gas boilers and get rid of them. So the purple line here, those are the annual emissions resulting from that project. Some embodied carbon at the beginning, and then it comes right down to effectively zero. Operationally zero by 2030 in this example. Now, this is a 3B. Now, that's not the carbon emissions impact. So again, you might get some people that might say, well, let's look at where we'll be in 2028. Only 50 tons a year, so we'll say 50. But that's no, you've got to add it all up. So the cumulative emissions year on year over the appraisal period, that's the carbon emissions impact. So here, that's adding all those things up, embodied and operational, the yellow line at the top. And those, you could say, are the controllable or direct carbon emissions, and there's no indirect carbon emissions for a category B. So it would be operationally zero by 2030, but it still had this overarching carbon emissions impact of 1,500 tons. So let's look at a project, same project, but that building is going to be doing research or development to help decarbonize the economy, even in a little bit. So the influence category here, you can see these green bars sticking out the bottom there. That's the estimated influence it will have beyond its geographical boundary in each year. Now you'll appreciate that's rough. That's going to be a rougher number than the controllable emissions. This is for a 3A. And if you add up those green bars, then you get this green line. Now, the green line is going to be less accurate than the orange line. The orange line, remember, that's building and operation, and that will be equally as accurate as cost, same sort of thing. The green line will have error bars, brackets around it. And then to get the carbon emissions impact, you add the yellow to the green, and that's the red here. So if you add the two together, you can see there's a lot of nuances in this, lots of different ways of looking at it. So the project's operationally zero by 2030. It stops emitting carbon effectively on its doorstep there. There's a carbon payback. That's another phrase. It's not an official phrase, but it's a nice way of thinking about it. If you're spending carbon to create something, and yet it's going to have a good negative influence going forward, at what point does it save more carbon than was emitted to create it? Carbon payback. Some people describe that as a carbon mortgage. And then depending on when your design year is, you've got this carbon emissions impact. That will depend on the economic case. So various different stakeholders across the deals have been following this, and it makes it really easy to see the overall state of play. Is this going to make things better or worse, and by what time? And it's a nice way of visualizing it. So I say example deal. So this is one of the deals where we went through this process, and you can see most of them were in control category 3, and most of them were in influence category B. And then, of course, that allows us to really zoom in on the C, on the 4, quite successfully, actually. So I'm not going to go into the next few bits in too much detail. I'll speed up a little bit, so apologies in advance, but I'd like to try and have at least 15, 20 minutes to discuss things, so maybe 15 minutes. Right, that's the Green Book. I mentioned that. This is what the Green Book requires. So all the business cases, if you're seeking government funding, and this is what had to be deployed through the City Deals program, they must all quantify whole life carbon. That's the carbon emissions impact. That has to be converted to an economic value using the BEIS carbon values. BEIS is a UK government industry department, and that's in pounds per tonne. I'll show you that in a minute. That's the carbon emissions impact cost. That has to be included in the economic case for all options. And how you manage carbon should be described in the management case. That's what the Green Book says. Now, not very many people know that that is there, even economists, even people working with the Green Book. I heard about people doing training on the Green Book, and I said to someone that was on the training, did they explain the carbon stuff? No, they didn't mention the carbon stuff. So it's really important. It's a heck of a lot of research has gone into it, and yet not too many people know it's there. So please spread the word about the existence of these requirements. These are what the BEIS carbon values used to be, and that's them there at the bottom there. So here we are at 2023. Up until a couple of years ago, the UK government used to value a tonne of carbon at £33, 33-ish pounds. So that's a negative value. So it's a demerit. It's a bad thing. If you send a tonne of carbon out, £33 it was. Then it changed to, now it's £252. This is the red line. These are the newish values. So remember, whole life carbon has to be estimated in tons. Then you multiply it by these values to get an economic valuation. And that is simply put into the cost benefit ratio of the economic case. So the more carbon you emit, the worse your project looks economically, according to official UK government economic evaluation. Not a lot of people know that. Currently £252 a tonne. Now, I won't read out all of these, but what I would do, if you're interested at all, is encourage you to download the guidance document from the Scottish Government website. And this is an appendix, and it in black and white says what needs to be in there when it comes to carbon. I'll read out just a couple of them. In the strategic case, the relationship between the project and the transition to net zero is referenced and clearly conveyed. And then in the middle one, the whole life carbon emissions impact, including embodied carbon, that shouldn't really need to be said, but I thought I'd better say it, has been estimated in tons over the economic appraisal period. It's then monetized, and then the management case explains how carbon is going to be minimized. So there you go. Now, this is in the Scottish guidance. We've gone a little bit further than the Green Book. I would say I don't think we really are, we're not even really pushing the envelope. All we've done is pulled out what is current and emerging best practice in the relevant fields and squished them together and simplified them and just said, here it is, guys. Do this, do that, and that's what we expect. I should also say, of all the project owners and stakeholders and local authorities I've spoken with about this, not one of them has complained about it. You know, maybe a couple were a little bit kind of, how are we going to do this? But there was a lot of explanation, a lot of training. So what I'm saying is, don't feel scared to ask for this. You know, if somebody was coming back to me and saying, we're not doing this, this is outrageous, then that would be contrary to national policy, you know, so that this is joining the dots. It's trying to work out how to fix it. A couple of final slides. This is my thoughts on how can we achieve net zero. Two main ways, command and control. So, you know, you set limits, you have regulations and you have regulators, and economic drivers, where you're pricing carbon, you're valuing carbon, you're applying carbon cost management, you're using the Green Book process. And I think we need a dual approach. It would be nice if we could be in the command and control box right now, but I feel we, and I don't just mean Scottish government, I mean we as a planet, are miles away from there right now. That is where we have proper carbon budgets, not just national carbon budgets, but sort of local authority carbon budgets. We have budgets for infrastructure, and we're working within those budgets, and we're making decisions on our projects based on those budgets properly. We're not quite there yet. Well, not by a long shot. I would hope we would get there maybe within, I reckon, 3 to 5 years from now. That's how long I think it's going to take to get there. But we've got economic drivers coming through. We've got the Green Book. And I think this dual approach is what's going to get us towards net zero most practically. And I suppose I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think that the Deal's carbon guidance is an early example of this hybrid approach that we need, which is, in its simplest form, could be described as a net zero test. Oh, quick plug for this report that I co-wrote with a colleague of mine a couple of years ago, where we were looking at these sort of things. We were looking at costs, we were looking at infrastructure, carbon, taxation, how to possibly reach net zero. And the fundamental, perhaps most important thing we covered was, we described it as the carbon cost tipping point, the point at which it costs more to reduce carbon further. And we said, we're not going to reach net zero without going past that carbon cost tipping point. In other words, we need to spend more money on getting to net zero up front. Otherwise, we're not going to get there at all. So in summary, this is what Chris Stark said a couple of years ago. The government here in Scotland is going to have to come up with proposals that show how Scotland will stride ahead of the UK on some of the key transitions that need to take place. The City Deals approach is part of that. It's a transparent and consistent way of assessing and minimizing carbon on projects and programs. It's got a simple taxonomy to determine how investments will affect the climate emergency, signpost-based best practice, and it's got value beyond the Deals program. It can be applied to almost anything. If there's a question that comes through along the lines of, can this be applied to X? Can this be applied to Y? Yes, absolutely. The NPF4, it's the National Planning Framework that's just recently come out for Scotland. There's an update on that came out a couple of weeks ago. And then when you go to the climate part, there's 2 paragraphs. The second paragraph is something like this already exists. It's the Scottish City and Regional Growth Deals Carbon Management Guidance, and it's a pointer towards that. So I could go on about this for a long time, but I think hopefully we've got time for a few questions now. So I'll stop sharing my screen and back to you, John.
Great. Lewis, thanks very much. That's been really interesting. I think you've presented this in very clearly and sort of demystifying some of the perhaps forbidding technical language that is sometimes used around this issue.